In this episode, you'll hear some sensitive topics. So with this trigger warning, if you have little ones around, please grab your headphones now.
When I learned how to become a yoga teacher, I was told your job as a teacher is to make sure that you can be this wonderful introduction to this beautiful practice and that you are opening the door for someone else to explore it for themselves. And so that has always stuck with me because I feel like that's the same way that I feel about mental health, about any sort of healing modality, is like, let me just open the door for you, and then the rest is up for you to explore, but at least let me stand by the door and welcome you in, because I think we all need that sense of safety. We won't really heal unless we feel safe. When I was talking to you, the reason that this I think was so life-changing for me is, one, it kind of put words to things that I already do with all of my clients. I just didn't have like a formal method that was going with it. But two, we did this exercise called parts integration. So a lot of what NLP is, because it's working with your unconscious mind, the results that you get are so much faster. And the methodology, the different exercises that you do are also really fast. There's 15 minutes, 10 minutes, like that kind of thing. So this parts integration, they always ask for volunteers. So I raised my hand. I intuitively knew, I'm going to get picked for this. So it was like the last day of the training, or the second to last day of training. And he's like, if you've ever used these words, a part of me wants to do this and a part of me wants to do that, like, raise your hand. And if there's something that you want to work through, raise your hand. So I raised my hand and I was like, okay, I was the first person he called on. A part of me wants to build my business and a part of me wants to move into coaching. And he's like, why is that a problem? I'm like, well, because I feel like I'm not doing either of them to the degree at which I could be building them. He's like, how is that a problem? I'm like, well, I feel like there's this gift and this purpose within me that I'm not fully living. How's that a problem? And then I started getting very emotional and being like, well, then my daughter can't see that whatever she wants to be, she could be. And so as I started getting increasingly emotional, physiologically, you could see it, he paused and he looked around the room. He's like, normally what I would do is I would ask for other volunteers to make sure that I'm picking the best example that you can all learn from. If it's all right with you, with all of you, can you see that her physiology has changed? And everyone's like, yes. He's like, do you mind if I just pick Judy as the demo? And they're like, no, totally, go. So I went on stage.
Folks, this week's guest is Judy Tsuei, founder of a branding and content strategy agency, author, and podcaster. Embarking on her healing journey through various modalities, you'll want to tune in to hear Judy's incredible story on how NLP has changed this entrepreneur's life. Let's cue the intro. Welcome to the Boom Vision Podcast, the show that empowers you to live an enriching life physically, mentally, and spiritually. I am your host, Benjamin Ye. And I created this podcast to give you perspectives on how to strengthen your mindset so that you can build optimal health, create aligned wealth, and connect with your higher self. It's all interconnected. Let's get to work. The greatest glory in living lies not in never falling, but in rising every time we fall. This quote was by Ralph Waldo Emerson. Hi folks, welcome to episode 57 of the Boom Vision Podcast. I'm happy to invite a new guest, Judy Tsuei. I actually reached out to Judy over a year ago, and for various reasons, we didn't reconnect until these past few weeks. It's funny how there's a divine timing for everything. And I'm just happy that the universe opened up the flow to allow us to reconnect this past month. As a brief background, Judy Tsuei is the founder of Wild Hearted Words, a powerful strategic content marketing agency. She also specializes in coaching women entrepreneurs of color and daughters of immigrants. Her book, The Little Book of Tibetan Rites and Rituals, debuted in March 2022, published by Ulysses Press, distributed by Simon & Schuster. Judy is a 2023 Tory Burch Foundation Fellow and has been featured in Fast Company, NASDAQ, Mind Body Green, and more. She's the host of the highly rated Fuck Saving Face podcast, empowering mental and emotional health for Asian Americans by breaking through taboo topics and driving real conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion using the power of storytelling. She has been a featured speaker and panelist for industry-leading companies. So without further ado, here's Judy Tsuei. Judy Tsuei, welcome to the Boom Vision podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. It's been quite an event in the making. We had this conversation quite a while back, so I'm excited to have it now.
Yeah, I am super excited. I know we've, everything has its timing, right? And, I'm just happy that we're able to make it today and love to dive in and just hear your story and your experiences. So, Judy, can we start with your origin story? Where did it start for you and what's led to what you are doing today?
I love that. I love the idea of the origin story. And I also, I forgot where I originally heard this. I heard it within the last year of saying you are the daughter of so-and-so who was the daughter of so-and-so. And I'd never honored my lineage in that way. And we'll dive into this later about, this practice that really shifted my relationship with my tiger parents, authoritarian parents. But I've since recently just really come into honoring the culture and the lineage that brought me here, which is not something that my awareness would have even had even a few months ago. I would say I've always wanted to honor that. I think that the places and the people we come from help make us who we are. And whether that's intergenerationally, and that's often if you're a child of immigrants coming from different types of trauma, or it could be beautiful gifts. So, one of my future ideas is to work with my daughter on different stories of people from our origin countries, because she's biracial. And to be able to tell those kind of the way that Goodnight Stories for Rebel Girls does. But in terms of, for me, I was born and raised in Los Angeles. I hated LA from a very early age because of the traffic. I cannot handle the traffic. The only time that I've liked LA is during the holidays because no one's actually from LA. So that's the normal way that you could drive. I think it's that sense of efficiency. I'm this is inefficient. But I was born and raised in LA. Then I left at 17 to go to Berkeley. And then from there, I tallied it up when I moved back to San Diego 5 years ago, I think it was now, that I've lived in over 40 something, places, actually had my address and called it home in 26 cities in 6 to 7 different countries. And a lot of that in the beginning was running away from myself, because once I left home, I finally felt the freedom to explore and express without this dominant force above me. But it involved a lot of healing through trauma. I had an eating disorder for a very long time that started when I was 17 and really ramped up for the next 15 years. I battled with different forms of depression and anxiety, which were undiagnosed for a very long time too. And even in my journey of healing, it was very trying at times, because I felt like I was asking the right questions or seeking the right answers. But everybody has a different path that they need to take to acquire their own wisdom. And I think that I was finding different wrong solutions, quote unquote, in order for me to find the right one. And so a lot of that moving around was running away, but I also became a travel writer, which was phenomenal. It's as great as anybody thinks that it is. I became a published author. I became the owner of a strategic branding and content marketing agency. I became a yoga teacher and a Reiki practitioner. And so I really endeavor to merge these sides of me. And I'll share with you that when I was younger, probably in my early 20s, when I was living back in LA and building a career in marketing and branding and advertising, I went to some event and they had a palm reader there. It was at some, fancy bar in LA. And she was looking at my palms and she said, "Oh, that's so interesting that your dominant hand is how you live your life. Your non-dominant hand is how you innately are. And yours are at odds with each other. So your non-dominant hand and how you were born was very like bohemian, free flowing, imaginative, like all of that kind of stuff. But the way you actually live your life is a very controlled, very type A kind of way. And so it really demonstrated to me that kind of nature versus nurture and growing up with these tiger parents. And so a lot of the work that I do now is a combination of all of my own personal journey in healing, as well as my professional expertise in, helping women entrepreneurs of color, and then really focusing on that entrepreneurial journey, focusing on mindset, which is what, you and I have this shared interest in, and then also motherhood. I'm now 45, my daughter's 8. And I think for women, most women, there's this question of, will I have kids? Do I want to have kids? And I helped raise my 3 younger siblings, so it was not at the top of my list. However, when I became a yoga teacher, everybody would always say, like, you're so nurturing, you're so maternal. I'm like, who are you talking about? And so I think it's thankfully for me, I have this magical story of how my daughter wanted to come into being. She was conceived and born on Kauai in Hawaii. And it was almost as though the decision was taken away from me, because it was so obvious she wanted to come into being that it would have taken a monumental force for me to say no. And in Hawaii, if you've ever been there, they say that the boundary between here and the other realms is a lot thinner. And so the magic and the mana and the energy of the lands, you can feel it so much more. And so I also didn't realize this until after I moved to Hawaii, that a lot of people say that the Hawaiian Islands correspond to the chakras. And so Kauai sits at the third eye point. And so,
interesting.
yeah, it's all about like self-reflection, personal growth, like a spiritual wisdom. And so when I met her dad, we knew each other for 2 weeks, and both of us felt compelled to have a child together. It was not biological clock ticking. It was, we could almost feel the force of her wanting to come into being. And so by 3 weeks of knowing each other, we consciously chose to conceive. And by 4 weeks of knowing each other, I was pregnant. And so, yeah. And before we conceived, I remember having that conversation with him, then swimming in Kalihiwai Bay, which is where all these spinner dolphins will come every season. You can be in the water with them. It's so amazing. And just felt flooded with full knowing, I'm going to have a girl. And I went home and I told him, like, I think if we choose to have a kid, she's going to be a girl. And he's like, oh, I know. He had already started dreaming about her at different phases of her life. So we never found out what her gender was. But we knew all along it was going to be a girl. So her name is Wilder. But, a lot of my, I guess, like the growth that I've experienced has come from this greatest adventure that I never knew I was going to say yes to. And it's really forced me to do a lot of hard things. I'm now divorced, and the way that relationship unfolded was not healthy. And so I had to continually make really hard decisions to put her as a priority, which the human part of me wanted to do anything, but I wanted justice. I wanted all of these things. But the mother part of me was like, nope, like this is going to be the best thing for her. And so all of these 3 things combined of, the marketing and the mindset and like motherhood have all brought me to where I am today. And that's kind of the work that I do. So that's it in a nutshell.
Oh my gosh. I feel like there's so many different rabbit holes we can go down with that. I didn't know. You said something earlier that really struck a chord with me, because I say it in a different way. You said that something to the effect of everyone has a different path to take to find their own wisdom. And it's so true, because it's like the way I say it is like, you can't look over someone else's test and copy the answers, because everyone's taking a different test. Right. And just because it works for someone one way doesn't mean it'll work for you, because everyone's taking a different test.
Yeah.
And to the same effect, like how we reach that wisdom for within ourselves is not all experiences are going to be treated equally, because everyone's going to have a different experience through it all.
Yeah.
And so I'm really curious, like, because I've gotten to know you as also a very spiritual person. Like your path in some senses is similar to my wife, where she was corporate. She also did yoga. We did energy healing, right? So I see a lot of similarities. I'm curious, Judy, what would you say was either a inflection point, or maybe it was a series of events that helped you realize, oh, you're really on like beginning your spiritual awakening or path, or however you want to phrase it?
Yeah, I love that you're asking that question. And I also want to add to what you just said is that even your own wisdom path, things that work for you now may not work for you in the future. Things that didn't work for you before may work for you now. So that's why it's this beautiful journey of like you becoming the master of you. And that's what I hope that everybody takes away from this is that I always used to say when I was teaching in yoga, from the beginning of time, ever after, there will never, ever be another you. So be wildly you. And there's a beautiful podcast episode that I heard with her. Her name is Michelle. I think it's pronounced Taller or Thaler, Thaller, but it's from Meditative Stories. She's an astrophysicist. She talks about time and about our existence in time. And I listened to that podcast episode over and over again, and I was crying because it was so beautiful the way that she relates the universe and our place in the universe and through time and her relationship with her husband. It was so beautifully said. So I encourage anybody who wants to be reminded, of your journey and your path. That episode is really, really great. But the inflection point for me, I would say is, I grew up the eldest of 4 kids, the first daughter of my immigrant parents who had to navigate the United States, essentially had to navigate the schooling system and, translating for my parents and translating for my grandmother. And my grandmother was the one unconditionally loving person in my life. All 3 of my other grandparents had passed by the time that I, had grown up. And everybody else viewed me as this black sheep. I think I was born. There's this amazing story called The Missing Zygote by Clarissa Pinkola Estes. And so that's another wild story. She wrote this book called Women Who Run with Wolves. It's this black book. It's really like dense, but all these myths and fables and stories about womanhood and the wild archetype. And I remember hearing about it, but then I was walking on Kauai with this guy. I think we were on a date or whatnot. And we walked along this stretch of beach that like you have to hike pretty far down. So there's not a lot of people there. There were only like 2 other people. By the time we walked back, there was no one there except for this one book that was placed on a rock. And when we walked over to it, it was Clarissa Pinkola Estes' book. And he was like, I think that's for you. I'm like, I think so too. So her book, The Missing Zygote, talks about how if you've ever felt like you did not belong in your family, there's a reason for that you were this little zygote in this basket with this like stork that was going to bring you to your family, the one who you were meant to be with, the one who matched your personality, but you were so excited, you were jumping up and down in the basket and you jumped and fell out of the basket. So you fell out into a family that didn't belong to you when your actual family was like a mile down the road. And so if you ever felt like the one who didn't fit in, the black sheep, like they wanted you to be quiet, but you were innately loud. And, my parents used to tell me like, you walk too loud, you talk too loud, you laugh too loud, all of these things. So I just did not fit there, which was funny because eventually I ended up being in a relationship where I'm like, oh my God, you guys were my family. Like you guys were the ones that we were supposed to, and he would have fit in so well with my family. And on the day that we finally called it on our relationship, this man who's an acupuncturist who never talked to me about spirituality, ironically, he was like, do you think that we were brother and sister in a past life? I'm like, oh my God. So my grandmother was unconditionally loving to me, despite the fact that all of my aunts and uncles and cousins used to like just use me as like a whipping post. Essentially, they would like, so like mean to me, so critical. My cousins who were a lot older than me, like over a decade and a half older than me, used to pull me into a room to yell at me for like what felt like hours at a time, because they said that I was being disrespectful to my grandmother, who was living with us at the time and helping to raise us, because we were the, youngest grandkids out of the bunch at the time. And in retrospect, I realized that I wasn't what they said that I was. I was just different. And like, so I would just speak the truth, and nobody wanted to actually hear the truth of how dysfunctional this family, was at times. And so after my grandmother passed, I actually didn't grieve her death for like a year. Like, even though my dad asked me, will you, share a eulogy? I didn't want to, because I would have been in front of all these people who, what I felt like, hated me growing up. And so I did it anyways, but I just didn't grieve her death. And so every single day, my grandmother would pray to the statue of Kuan Yin, who later I would discover is the goddess of compassion and lost children. And she prayed to this statue because when she became a widow and had 5 kids to raise, they had to emigrate from Taiwan over to the United States. And she was so seasick in the boat. She didn't know how she was going to survive. I guess at the time after her husband passed, it was almost like she was catatonic. But then she looked in her luggage and this statue of Kuan Yin had fallen in there somehow. And she viewed that as like the faith that she needed to like get through. So every single day growing up, I remember her lighting incense to the black and white photo of my grandfather, and then to Kuan Yin. Then after she passed, a friend of mine was like, hey, you should come with me to this power yoga class in Santa Monica. And I just moved back to LA from all of my, whirlwind adventures. And so I was like, okay. And I went to power yoga and have never sweated so much in my life. I'm not a sweater. So like I was like drenched and then felt so amazing. And it felt like the moment that my hands came together in prayer pose, it felt like coming home. And so that was such a wild experience for me. So I kept going back to the class, and it just so happens they had 2 locations, one on top of a spiritual bookstore. And so I walked into the spiritual bookstore one day, killing some time before class started, and I saw Kuan Yin, like a mini statue of Kuan Yin. So I, didn't know other than that's who my grandmother prayed to. So I bought the little statue, brought it home. And over the course, I was probably, I think I had just gotten back from China where my eating disorder had gotten the worst. I was now in therapy. I was like basically like having to deal with all the things that I had run away from. And this little statue kind of sparked this whole spiritual journey where all of a sudden my grandmother was showing up in my life after her death. And so I had a lot of anger and rage towards my family going through all this therapy. I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to go, figure out how to release this anger. And so Krav Maga, like Israeli self-defense. Sure, let's go try that. And so I was, in Krav Maga, it doesn't matter what size your opponent is, they're not going to hold back. So I was like sparring with guys who were like over 6 feet, and it was just a lot. And so there was one other woman in the class, and she and I gravitated towards each other because at least we were like a comparable size. And so I remember this one time we were doing this technique where you had to come up from behind the person and grab them and pick them up. And so we did it repeatedly. And the only things that I knew about this woman was that she owned a dog walking business. And the only thing that she knew about me was that I was a writer. And so, after that sparring match, I went home the next morning. I woke up, I'm like, oh my God, my ribs hurt so bad. I can't breathe. And so I texted her and I'm like, oh, I think you bruised my ribs. And she felt so bad. She's like, oh my gosh, let me come over. And like, I'm a Reiki master. I can come over and, help heal you essentially.
Oh, no way.
I was like, okay, sure. And I had Reiki done one other time, and it was not like a very profound experience. So I was like, okay, like, sure. And at the time, I was living in Santa Monica in an amazing studio apartment, knew that I had to break up with my boyfriend, had all these like, things unfolding with therapy. And so I never nap, but I took a nap and I woke up from the nap and was crying, just so sad. And I looked at the clock like, oh my gosh, she's going to be here any minute. So I like washed my face off. She came in, she showed up with like a massage table, like, laid it all out. And right before she had gotten there, when I was crying, this is in my mid-20s. So my grandmother passed when I was like 21. And I just, every time I would get so sad, I would just think about her. She was the only person who I could relate to and have any sort of solace with. So I was thinking about her. I was probably talking out loud to her. And then, my friend Kara sets up the table and she says, hey, before we get started, I just want to let you know that I'm not a medium by any means, but sometimes when I do Reiki, the energetic channels open up and a spirit will show up. And so she's telling me this stuff. I'm like, okay, like, sure. And she said, so if that happens, I'm just letting you know, like, I'll tell you about it. And, like, we'll just see where it goes. I'm like, okay. So she starts working on me. And the second that she puts her hands like hovering over the crown of my head, she's like, do you have a grandmother who passed away? I'm like, yes. And she's like, well, she's in the room right now. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And she said, it's kind of funny, like your grandmother has this energy where she's like watching over me to make sure that I don't screw up on you. And I'm like, okay. And she said, so, now's a really good time. If there's anything that you want to communicate with your grandmother, you can, share that with her. And I asked, well, do I say it in English or Mandarin? Because she doesn't understand English. And she's like, it's more of an energetic thing. And I was like, oh, okay. So, I kind of, in my own way, was communicating to her, I guess, while I was on the table. And she kept working on me. And, she was laughing again. She's like, your grandma's still here. Like, she's not going away. And I was like, okay. And at the end of the session, she said, all right, well, your grandmother's still in the room. And sometimes when a spirit shows up, they want to give the person who I'm working with a gift. And I can't usually see what the gift is, but I can tell you what the sense of it is that I'm getting. And she's like, for you, all I see is the color red. It's like everywhere, just like red, like, and I was like, okay, well, thinking in my mind, red's a good luck color in Chinese. Like maybe that's like what it is. And she's like, I just encourage you to, over the next 1 to 2 weeks, just be observant and see, because that's usually when about the gift will appear. I'm like, okay. And then she packed up, left, and I was like, what just happened? Like, what are you talking about? So then during that time, I was, a consultant and really wanting to heal. Like that was like my main priority. And so I was trying every single modality under the sun that you could imagine. So I was a consultant at Neutrogena at the time. And this really quirky, much older lady came in. And somehow we got onto this conversation. She's like, well, have you ever tried hypnotherapy? I'm like, no. She's like, here, like you should try it. She gave me the contact information. The hypnotherapist was literally across the street from my Krav Maga studio. So I went to go see this woman and I was like, this just seems like a really deep guided meditation. Like, I'm not really sure that this is working. I tended to have like very high defenses up. And so then this hypnotherapist, she brought me through this practice and I was like, okay. Then at the end of it, she's like, all right, before I bring you out of hypnosis, I want you to know that every time you see the color red, you're going to know that it's okay to feel your feelings. Every time you see the color red, it's going to look brighter than it ever has before. And you are going to know that it's okay to feel your feelings. So you will go outside, you'll see a stop sign, you'll see a stoplight. It will look brighter than it ever has before. And just remember, every time you see that, it's okay to feel your feelings. And I was like, okay, sure. So we finish up. I leave. I meet my friend for yoga that night. And I was like, oh my gosh, back to the Power Yoga Studio. It's like, hey, I did this wild thing with this woman. It was called Reiki. And as I'm relating the story to him, I'm like, oh my God, that was the gift. Like finally like clicked in my mind that was the gift, is that my grandmother wanted to let me know that every time you feel your feelings, it's totally okay, whatever feelings those are. And so from that moment, every single time in my life up until now, if ever I'm in doubt or I have a question or I need more support or a reminder from the universe that everything's going to be okay, the statue of Kuan Yin will show up somehow, some way, or some sort of reminder of my grandmother. And I feel like that has been like the thread that has like sparked, that spiritual journey.
Wow. As I'm listening to you telling these stories, like my whole body, by the way, is just vibing. Because because I've become more, before we started this interview, I was talking about how, we increase our sensitivity.
Yeah.
This might be a random question, but like,
Yeah.
did your grandmother have like a favorite color in terms of
Not
what she wore?
No, my grandmother was so private when she was alive.
Okay.
And so nobody really knew about her. And the only reason that I knew that what my family members were saying to me about how mad she was at me, that I wasn't respecting her and like all that kind of stuff was a lie, was because after she passed, my dad asked me, can you go through all the VHS tapes and find, anything with your grandma on it so that we can play that during the funeral and during the service. And when I was going through all these videos, there were videos of her with me and my younger sister, who was like the golden child in our family. She did everything right. And so the polar opposite of me. But I watched my grandmother like reach for me all the time, try to hold on to me, try to almost use me as like protection against the discomfort she felt of when all the attention was on her, like during her birthday or during like, something like that. And so watching that interaction, I'm like, oh my gosh, my grandmother really loved me. Like everything that they said, like that they were trying to get me to fall in line, quote unquote, that was just their tactics. But like, she didn't feel like that towards me at all. So it was really beautiful to be able to see that.
Yeah. And just to bring context of why I'm asking this question, I know it sounds random, but you're describing about red is sort of like, that was a gift she gave you about the color and to let you almost giving you permission and grace of like, no, it's okay to let your emotions
Mm-hmm.
flow through you, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm just seeing this image of like a grandmother just wearing this like green, almost like emerald colored dress or something.
Mm.
I don't know if that makes any sense or not,
Mm.
but it
Mm.
was just something that just kind of popped in my head as I'm listening to you talk.
Thank you for
Because
sharing.
yeah, when I'm listening to you talk too, in it almost in a similar fashion. My first introduction to energy work was theta healing when my wife and I had a theta session. And before I never knew, like I think through just my own personal experiences growing up, and I've shared this on my show, like I just kind of shut my emotions as a way of a protective mechanism, right? And it
Mm-hmm.
was
Mm-hmm.
theta that kind of opened the floodgates. And then it's like, oh my God, I'm just like a hot mess. Before I would never cry in movies, and all of a sudden I could watch a
Mm-hmm.
commercial and I'm just like tearing up because and in the first month of that, like I didn't know what was happening. And it's like,
Mm.
oh my God. Like I don't know if you experience a similar way, but when you let the emotions all of a sudden just flow where it's like opening the floodgates, it's you can't you can't control it and you have
Mm.
to reach like an equilibrium. But the
Mhm.
first month or two, I was just like a hot mess, right? Everything just kind of
Mhm.
triggers me. But then you eventually reach and it's like, hey, it's okay, let it flow. Otherwise, you're going to have it bottled up inside, which is just not going to be
Mhm.
good in the long run, right?
Mhm.
And so I'm curious, like, from your experiences of Reiki, and you mentioned about different modalities like, hypnotherapy, what was the most impactful one? And we're going to go into the one where the most recent one you've learned is
Mhm.
NLP, right? So
Mhm.
before we talk about NLP, I'm just curious, like, of the other modalities you've experienced, were there ones that really stuck out more than others for you in your journey? Because I think what you said earlier before also resonates, where in whatever stage of life you're in, it may work,
Mhm.
but as you evolve, it might not, right? But I'm just
Mhm.
curious, like in your last, call it 20 plus years of
Mhm.
exploring and being curious about these different modalities, was there a particular one that really stuck out, and why?
I think that the first, experience that I ever had with therapy with a good therapist, I had therapists who are not good. And so I want to caution anybody who's on the journey to finding any type of support that you really check in with yourself to make sure that the practitioner who you're working with has integrity, that they're good at what they do. Because I've worked with the whole gamut of people who on the external perception might seem one way, but like internally was very different.
Hmm.
I've had the luxury of working with a lot of different spiritual luminaries because I used to be an editor of a conscious music and events magazine. So I had one-on-one time and I got to also see like behind the stage and like all of that kind of stuff. And I just want to remind everybody, everybody's human. That's why we're here. We are here on this experience to have a human experience. And if anybody wants to, kind of understand that divinity that exists within and around us, as well as our human experience, Anita Morjani wrote this book, Dying to Be Me. And it's about her near-death experience and then how, when she was on the other side, the things that she perceived and experienced. And I recommended that to my life coach at the time, who then recommended it to all of his other clients once he read it, because it was so eye-opening that when you are a soul, everything's, quote unquote perfect. It's your utopia, or however you want to define it. And so as a soul, you look at the human experience as though this is heaven, as though this is the beautiful place you want to be, because you get to feel all of the feelings, the good, the bad, the
Hmm.
ugly. You get to experience all of it. And that is your purpose here on this planet, is to have that human experience. Otherwise, we would not have incarnated in this human form. And so I think a lot of times when we're on the spiritual path and journey, we want to try to like forego our humanness. We want to try to escape it, leave it, like there's something wrong with this, but there's not anything wrong with being human. You are human. And again, it comes back to that mastery of self. And so for some people, it will be that enlightenment state that's what they're aiming for. For some people, it will be, I'm going to be the best mom and dad that I could be to this child who I'm raising. For some people, it's like, I'm going to be the best team member, the best employee, whatever it is. Like I always remember this interview with the guy who created the movie Clerks. And they
Hmm.
asked him, like, why do you create these movies about like people who are just like doing like these like inane kind of like, everyday kind of jobs? And he's like, because that's most of the people that I know. And some people are very happy going to work, coming home. Like that's, and so I think we forget that, especially if you're in this if you're raised in any sort of environment that was on a pursuit of excellence, like I think you
Mm.
try to be something else other than what you are, and what you are is beautiful. Again, like, be wildly you. So I think in the beginning, just even being able to talk to a therapist and like be validated that the experiences that I had that like inwardly I knew were wrong, like, or like very detrimental, were in fact detrimental, but my survival mechanism was such that it wasn't that bad, but that, similar to what you said, is just pushing and shoving that baggage down further and further. And so, one of the things, and I'll talk about this when we go into NLP, and my daughter was born on Kauai. Kauai is my favorite place on the planet. The second that my feet touched soil there, it felt like home. So similar to yoga, when I was there, it felt like home. And so this Hawaiian tradition is understanding that when your baggage gets lit up, when something comes up, you celebrate it. You're like, wow, that must mean that I am ready to get rid of it now. How amazing is that I've evolved to this place now where I can get rid of this, instead of what we do a lot of times in Western society, which is like, let me just shove that further down because I don't want to deal with it right now. And if you weren't prepared to deal with it, then it wouldn't have come up. Your unconscious mind could not have lit it up for you because you would have still been trying to protect. So all of that, like just being validated for the first time in my life, was so amazing. And then art therapy, surprising to me, like I cannot draw at all, but I can make things. I can make things pretty with the materials that are given to me. So I can collage like a fiend, and I can like go to like some scrap store and make beautiful things out of that. I can model things and like make those pretty good if I saw it on Pinterest or whatever. But I think that was unexpected to me because it got me to a place where I could get out of my rational, logical state and be in like an artistic, creative space. And so I think that unfolds for people in different ways. I think Mother Nature is creative. So also my first kind of like really understanding of healing and the power of spirituality was being in nature. Like nature is so healing. It's so beautiful. And my love of the ocean, I surf, and my formerly perfectionistic attitude would be like, you need to be a better surfer. But regardless of that, I still am in the water, just like enjoying how beautiful it is. I see dolphins all the time. Like, and so I think those things were the introductory moments that were very pivotal for me. And I've come back to therapy, like now and again. There's been regular consistency in that cadence and then going away. But when I learned how to become a yoga teacher, I was told your job as a teacher is to make sure that you can be this wonderful introduction to this beautiful practice, and that you are opening the door for someone else to explore it for themselves. And so that has always stuck with me, because I feel like that's the same way that I feel about mental health, about any sort of healing modality, is like, let me just open the door for you, and then the rest is up for you to explore. But at least let me like stand by the door and welcome you in, because I think we all need that sense of safety. We won't really heal unless we feel safe. And I'll just share one more story in regards to that. When I became a yoga teacher and I was teaching regularly after we graduated at my friend's studio that they had just opened, I would have like one student show up, or like maybe two, maybe three. The studio is very small. But this one time, this guy showed up. Like in the morning, I showed up to class, no one showed up. Then I had like a 2-hour gap. So I would just do work in between and then wait and then open the doors again. So this guy knocked on the door in between those two classes. And he's like, hey, is this a yoga student? I'm like, yeah, but our next class isn't for like another, hour if you want to come back. And he was sharing with me, he's like, yeah, so I got hit by a car like a while back. I was on a motorcycle. I got hit by a car. And so I'm just now getting back into my body, like being like okay and healthy and functional. So can I do this? I was like, we will make sure that we modify the practice, and you let me know if there's anything that's like not okay. And he's like, well, also like my brain doesn't really work the same that it did before. And so sometimes things can be really slow. I'm like, that's all right. Like we can go at your pace. And he was saying like, yeah, I've lost a lot of family members and like friends to this because it was so hard for me in the beginning when I was healing. And like a lot of people didn't have patience for me. I think he even said that he had a girlfriend at the time who like, wasn't with him on the journey of healing. So I was like, okay, well, thank you for sharing. Like we will work with it. And so he ended up coming back being the only person in class. So he basically got like a private session, and I was able to work with him like really diligently and check in with him and all that kind of stuff. So he started coming back to class regularly. And later on, I don't even know how many months later this was, he pulled me aside and he's like, hey, I just wanted to let you know that I've always wanted to try yoga. I was really intimidated and very nervous. I didn't think that I could do it. But when I came and knocked on that door and asked you those questions, you were so welcoming and made it feel so okay that it made it feel okay for me to try. And now it's like the best thing that like I've done, like just for his healing journey and whatnot. And so that's always been so rewarding to think that because I was welcoming and smiling. He's like, it was because you smiled at me. Like you were like so, like nice, and like that helped him on his trajectory. And, like you never know who you can help. That's why I always say, like, just by you being you, you never know in a basic everyday interaction how you can really help set someone else's trajectory differently.
Yeah. Sorry, I almost felt like the emotions of that guy as I'm listening to you
Yeah.
talk. So it's that's so beautiful for you to create and hold that space for people. It is those moments that has profound impact in someone's life that more than you can
Yeah.
know, you know?
And the ripple effect
Wow.
that he's going to continue to create,
Yeah.
because now he's more whole and more, and I told the yoga studio owners, I was like, hey, just so the student comes in, he's like been in an accident. And so like, just be mindful, like, when you're teaching and whatnot. And they were just like, he is phenomenal. Like just watching, because if they come back to class regularly, you get to see their progression and their evolution. And it's so lovely to
Yeah.
it's such an honor to witness that.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely felt that, and it says a lot about you in terms of your character too. So I just want to acknowledge that too,
Thank
Judy, because
you.
that's it's a beautiful thing. That's a beautiful spirit. In terms of all of these different techniques and modalities, I think the latest one that you've embraced is NLP.
Mm-hmm.
So love to go into that. Can you tell the audience what is NLP and what makes it so inspiring for you to really dive into this particular technique?
Yeah. I used to beat myself up of how much money and time and energy I spent into like healing.
Hmm.
There was a period of time where I was like mad at my family. Like, if you guys weren't so up, then like I wouldn't have had to like devote all of myself to this. But now I can see that it's given me like a whole breadth of awareness of all of the different modalities that are there. I mean, I last year invested a lot of money in this brain rewiring retreat, in hopes that it would like create some fundamental shifts or changes. And I even like pre did sessions, and then like it was like a whole thing. But like what it's given me now is awareness of what's worked and what hasn't worked, and the
Hmm.
benefits and the potential drawbacks of each.
Hmm.
So when I came to neurolinguistic programming, I'd done all of these modalities, and it's like a 4-day beginner intensive, the specific one that I did. And I first heard about NLP when I was living in Austin. I had a really powerful community of women entrepreneurs. A lot of them were starting to dive into it, but I didn't have the bandwidth at the time to like take on another thing.
Hmm.
So it was in my awareness for a long time. And then like fast forward 5, some odd years. And then I was in a gratitude circle. And one of the guys who I'd met in Austin had said like, hey, like maybe you could look into NLP. And I'm like, thank you for reminding me that that was something that I wanted to do. So I found out that they had a 4-day intensive from 9 a.m. to 8 p.m. in Los Angeles, and my family still lives in LA. So I brought my daughter to my parents' house, and I was like, hey, can you watch her for the next 4 days? And my daughter is now 8. So yeah, I think this was when she's 8. It's the first time in all of their lives that they've ever spent that much time together
Hmm.
consecutively or just as a total. And so in order for me to go to this training, I had to rely upon them, which in the past, I couldn't rely upon them. Like they just had their own emotional wounds, and I just like could not rely upon them. And
Mm.
so this was like a big act of trust. My daughter is very emotionally aware and very articulate. And
Mm.
so she knows how to stand up for herself. So I like trusted that like she would speak up for herself if she needed to. And then we did this training. And if you Google NLP, you'll find a lot of people say like, oh, like, it's like brainwashing, or it's like it's got a lot of flack because I think people
Mm.
don't understand what it is. And even when I was at the training, I was at this like hotel convention room, and I would remember sitting in the hotel restaurant, and some guy walks up to the bar, and I'm sitting there just like doing my own work or whatnot, and he's like, did you see, talking to the bartender, did you see that there's that NLP thing, and you know what that is? That's like all like a bunch of like lies and like brainwashing and like whatever. And so like that was like the consensus.
Mm.
So the guy who I learned it from, his name is Dr. Matt James, and he was raised in Hawaii from a very young age and trained with this very deep lineage of Huna like teachers. And so because of my time in Hawaii, when he mentioned the name, I'm like, oh my gosh, like this is legit. Like that lineage, they would only choose you if you were a legitimate healer and or just guide, teacher, whatever it is.
Mm.
And so he got to meet Tony Robbins from a very young age because his parents owned a transcendental meditation center in Hawaii. And so he did the fire walk with Tony Robbins at a very young age. He learned about NLP from his dad at a young age, and he still went off and was like, this stuff is like malarkey. I don't want to do this, even though I was raised with it. Went into his 20s, tried to pursue the corporate realm, and realized this is not what he wanted to do, and had a total like breakdown, and came back to his family business essentially, and realized like, oh my gosh, this is like where it is, like these answers are where it is. And then became a doctor of integrative psychology, and like all of this kind of stuff. So the
Mm.
whole point of NLP is to model excellence. And so it will be an ever evolving field. And the understanding is that if you can understand the framework through which someone created the success that you want to see, you can model that framework and apply it into your own life. So all you need to know is one person who's achieved kind of like the results that you want to get to, figure out how they did it, and then figure out how to apply it to yourself. So the NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, the neuro part refers to your nervous system and the mind. And we perceive this through our five senses: sight, sound, touch, taste, smell. And then linguistic refers to language, but it's also nonverbal communication. And this is where your memories and beliefs are stored. And then programming, which now they said if we could have named it differently, knowing what we know now about like apps, we would have named it like apps, because it's basically like figuring out how to work the app of your brain, like the app of yourself.
Mm.
And so you reprogram your internal apps to support your desired outcomes. And the reason that, this is so important is because it works a lot in your unconscious mind, and that's where your power and your energy is. So if you're experiencing something in your life that you don't want to be experiencing, and you're consciously aware you don't want to be experiencing it, but like something is like hiccuping between like your motivation to not do that and then to want to achieve a different outcome, NLP is great for that, because it's like figuring out like what that block is, how do you release the block. And a lot of times, what I learned, which is really interesting, is like, I'm a storyteller by trade. That's what my entire business has been built on. But when you're working with someone and you're listening to their stories, you're actually listening to the context rather than the content, because the
Mm-hmm.
content is superfluous. And so like that was such a big kind of like aha moment for me of like, oh. And so there's a couple of like key tenets, which is like perception is interpretation. So however you perceive your reality, that's what you're going to believe is true. And so our brains are processing it every single second, 2 million bits of information. Our conscious mind cannot possibly take all of that in. So it's grabbing like 126 bits. So 126 out of 2 billion, and that becomes your reality. So if you were to drop that 126 bits, like, so imagine there's a room full of toothpicks, you pick up 126, you drop that 126, you pick up a different 126, you have a different reality. It's not to say that didn't exist. It's been existing this whole time. You just didn't know it because your perception is based on whatever framework you grew up with, whatever belief systems you had, whatever memories and experiences you've had, especially anything that hasn't been healed. All of that becomes like part of the lens through which you see your reality. I know I've been offering a lot of books. I read a lot. So one of the other books is Dr. Jacob Lieberman. And he wrote multiple books. He's an optometrist who became a very spiritual person. And there's like a yellow cover, I'm forgetting. It's called Light, something where he says like astrophysicists and religious people, the way astrophysicists describe light and the way religious people describe God, those terms can be used interchangeably. And so he says that like when your eyes are where you're perceiving all of this information, but it needs to get translated. And when you cannot translate that much information that's coming in through your eyes, that's where a lot of your intuition can come from. That's where a lot of like that gut feeling can come from, because it's going somewhere. That information is going somewhere. So that idea is really strong in neurolinguistic programming, is to help you pick up a different 126 bits that will serve you better. And so that, with what you're talking about in your show and the work that you do, like the energy, mind, body connection, because there's the higher self, the conscious mind, and the unconscious mind. And so this works with both your conscious and your unconscious mind to like get the ultimate like outcome. And, you know, in what we learn in NLP is there's like a mastery of life and a mastery of like spirit. And so you're constantly evolving through that cycle. And at different phases of your life, there will be different, you know, moments where you're focusing on different things. So NLP works with that. And then it's also the idea that we are all at cause, is what it's called. Like we are all responsible for the change that we want to see. So even if things are beyond our control, something's happened in our lives, yes, that happens for sure. And your response to it and what you take in and what you let go of, that part is your choice, and being at cause versus being at effect. So I think, I mean, for anybody who's on a spiritual path, like all of these things kind of like make sense. It's putting, you know, a methodology to these different things. And when I was talking to you, the reason that this, I think, was so life-changing for me is, one, it kind of put words to things that I already do with all of my clients. I just didn't have like a formal method that was going with it. But two, we did this exercise called parts integration. So a lot of what NLP is, because it's working with your unconscious mind, the results that you get are so much faster. And the methodology, the different exercises that you do are also really fast. There's like, you know, 15 minutes, 10 minutes, like that kind of thing. So this parts integration, they always ask for volunteers. So I raised my hand. I intuitively knew, I'm like, I'm going to get picked for this. So it was like the last day of the training, or the second to last day of training. And he's like, who has, if you've ever used these words, a part of me wants to do this and a part of me wants to do that, like raise your hand. And if there's something that you want to work through, raise your hand. So I raised my hand and I was like, okay, I was the first person he called on. A part of me wants to build my business and a part of me wants to move into coaching. And he's like, why is that a problem? I'm like, well, because I feel like I'm not doing either of them to the degree at which I could be building them. He's like, how is that a problem? I'm like, well, you know, like I feel like there's this gift and this purpose within me that I'm not like fully living. How's that a problem? And then I started getting very emotional and being like, well, then my daughter can't see that whatever she wants to be, she could be. And so as I started getting increasingly emotional, physiologically, you could see it, he paused and he looked around the room. He's like, normally what I would do is I would ask for other volunteers to make sure that I'm picking the best example that you can all learn from. If it's all right with you, with all of you, can you see that her physiology has changed? And everyone's like, yes. He's like, do you mind if I just pick Judy as the demo? And they're like, no, totally, go. So I went on stage and he's like, okay, like here's what it is. You pull out your hands and you put them in front of you so that you can see. And you check in with like the unwanted part of you. Like, who does that look like to you? Like your internal representation. Who does that, you know, look like? And then you flip over to the other side, the part of you that's at opposite ends of this. Who does that look like? And you continue to do this exercise, asking the same question over and over until you get to a point where you can see that both of these parts of you want the same shared ultimate goal. And it always inevitably happens. That higher goal is always the same. And so they're coming at it at different ways of trying to protect you, trying to like keep you safe, trying to, you know, like let you live a happy life, but in whatever interpretations that these parts of you have. And as you're doing this, your hands naturally start to come closer together. And so he asked, do you notice that your hands are coming closer together? I'm like, yeah. And he's like, can you bring the hands together all the way? I'm like, nope, they are still at odds with each other. He's like, great. And so we continued to do this exercise until they naturally came together. And I was able to bring my hands to my heart and integrate. And then after every exercise, there's like a test to see if it actually worked. And you check in with yourself and you find like a past experience and how do you feel about it now? A future experience, like, how do you envision that you're going to feel about it then? So we did this exercise. I felt no conflict after that of like building my business. And since then, like I've seen so much more alignment, symmetry. I've started getting clients just by like going out surfing, going to the coffee shop, like things like just so easy. And the other thing is because NLP focuses on like 6 key areas of your life. So there's what usually most people want to focus on is career. Like, what's my purpose? What am I supposed to do? Personal growth and development, relationship. And this is like your intimate partnership, your family. So anybody that you believe is like family, usually it's like blood family, because that's where a lot of like baggage can come up. Your physical health, and then your spirituality. So you focus on one of those key areas when you're doing one of these like exercises, but because you're completely interconnected, it's going to have a ripple effect in the other areas of your life. And so what was so unexpected for me that this, like, I think it took 15, maybe 20 minutes max. Afterwards, people came up to me and they're like, that was so wild to watch, like how you integrated that. And then whatever I perceived as a problem before those 15 minutes totally went away. I'm like, I don't remember what was the problem before. Like, I don't even know. And so like, that's often the same response that you'll get when you do one of these exercises. You can't even recall what the problem was. It's like so deeply integrated. And so I was like, okay, they were like, that was such an amazing example, like whatnot. And I remember driving home thinking, wow, I'm so grateful for my parents for watching Wilder. I would not have been able to do this had they not watched her. And then the next morning, I was like, let me take you guys out to breakfast. This is something that I have not done in years because I was so resentful at them for so many different things. I'm like, you owe me. I don't need to like, whatever, which is not how I am as a person. And so I took them out to breakfast. Then we were just like hanging out. And then my mom ordered something, opened it up, decided she didn't want it anymore, closed it all up. And she's like, I want something else. And I'm like, what? And so I was like, you haven't even like tried it. And she's like, well, I want something else. I want something sweet. I'm like, okay. And like my response, I could see that it hurt her feelings, like what my response was. So she went up with my dad. They ordered something else. They came and sat back down. We finished up breakfast. We're driving home. And then I pick up the phone and call her, which is also something I never do. And I was like, hey, Mom, I just want to apologize for the way that I showed up at breakfast. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make you feel bad. Thank you so much for like watching Wilder. I couldn't have done this. Da, da, da. Never would have done that before, ever. And then from there, my relationship with them profoundly shifted. They started coming down all of the time. They have a camper now. They were driving down to like camp here in San Diego to hang out with Wilder. Wow. They brought me a new washer dryer. We hung out all day. Like my dad will call me now for no reason. I'm like, hey, how's it going? What the things I was watching my mom, the things that she would normally do that would like bug the crap out of me. I was like, that's interesting. And then just turn away and do like something else. And like, one of the things about NLP is like it removes the energetic charge to whatever it is that you had like a problem with before. So that alone is so valuable to me because that's not even what I was working on. I was working on career, and this ended up happening. And I think my parents are in their mid to late 70s now. Like, how much more time do I get with them? And does my daughter get with them? And the fact that I can enjoy their company now for however much time there is, like, that is a huge gift that I can't even, otherwise the trajectory I was going on without doing this would have been so terrible. Like, it would have, I think, led to so much guilt and shame and other things. So yes,
Judy, when I'm listening to you share that story, I would say similar parallels to both my wife and I have taken landmark education, and in some similar veins of people on the outside never taken it. If you read online, similar comments, right? Like, hey, is this a call? Whatever it is. And what's really ironic, I had this image come to me like literally maybe 3-4 days ago I didn't understand at the time. Having this conversation, oh, I'm able to connect the dots. That was for in preparation of this interview. And
Amazing.
and the image I got, Judy, was that like in nature, you learn so much in nature, right? In nature, if you're like a growing plant or tree, you naturally want to go towards where the sun shines because
Hmm.
that's where you get, and I use this analogy a lot in the sense that what brings you joy is like the sun. It's where you
Hmm.
feel and you're really in alignment with that, right? However, if you are getting sun from a specific direction, let's say it's like, coming from whatever reason it's coming from the east, right?
Hmm.
But you have wind that is blowing like from the south and going blowing at you at a completely different direction, you're going to be at odds. So
Hmm.
when you make that integration of that awakening of realizing what doesn't serve you and you naturally want to go a different direction, but if your surrounding environment is still pushing up against that, you're
Hmm.
going to get that kind of resistance.
Hmm.
And so people that don't understand that or want to have that awareness of that change, I think a lot of times in the pursuit of that self-improvement, then you might make some fundamental shifts internally that externally then changes your behavior and what serves you and what you want to do. But for other people, it's like, wait, where's the old Judy? Where's the old Ben?
Hmm.
Stay status quo,
Hmm.
right? There's
Hmm.
going to be that opposing, there might be those opposing forces, and that might cause friction in relationships
Hmm.
and whatnot, which
Hmm.
might lead to them to feel that way. Now, having that said, because I never taken NLP, but
Hmm.
having that said, I do feel it's very important to have that feeling of trust and alignment with the
Hmm.
teacher, with the someone teaching, because just because they're in the game of spirituality or in the game of self-development, it's not necessarily means like, oh, they all have really great intentions, right? You
Hmm.
never know. And so I love the fact that you pointed it out when you spoke to that specific instructor, and with that connection of why and knowing, no, if they came from that lineage, okay,
Hmm.
that has a very high standard. So it allows you, at least as a gut check, okay, at least there's that inherent
Yeah.
trust with that. And it's so important because what I look for now, and I didn't understand this before, because look, we're all interconnected, right?
Hmm.
Everything is energy. We're all energy.
Hmm.
Money is energy. But one
Hmm.
of the things I look for now is what we say, whatever they say, does that vibration match how they say it and why they're saying it?
Hmm.
Because you hear, usually the first thing you hear is the what. And it might
Hmm.
sound sweet, it might sound great, right? And you might be like compelled to, you're something that draws it. But
Hmm.
I've learned to at least activate my senses of, wait, is how they're going about it, the execution of it, but
Hmm.
also why they're doing it. Is that aligned? Because you can't fake that energy. You can say it and it might come off a certain way, but the intentions you really can't. If you have that detection mechanism of it or learn how to strengthen that muscle, it's really, really important.
Yeah.
And so I just want to, does that analogy resonate with the whole
Oh, yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. Yeah. I feel like there's plenty, if you research about all the spiritual teachers who are very, very controversial because of the things that they have done. And a
Mm,
lot of NLP tells you to leave your judgments at the door, to show up with an open mind. And the reason that I also really appreciate the teacher who I learned from is he's like, look, I'm a spiritual guy who loves to drink red wine and eat steak. And if you have a problem with that, I understand, because that's not the typical spiritual guy. And like during our teaching, he's like dropping F bombs like all over the place. He's like, this is me. Like, this is who I am. And it's totally okay if you are not aligned. There's a lot of forgiveness techniques that I can teach you and like whatnot. And it's totally fine. But this is how I am authentically. And so the way that you would meet me out on the street and the way that you would meet me here are going to be the same person. And
mm,
I will fully acknowledge my mistakes. I will fully acknowledge, like, when I've done something wrong, or, and I think that everybody like touts authenticity and transparency now, but it requires genuine courage and bravery to be truly authentic and
yeah.
truly transparent. And
Yeah.
because it means like you have to acknowledge the shadow as much as the light, like as you were talking about. And so the brighter you shine, the bigger shadow you cast. And so like there's like the temptation, the opportunity, and the learning. And I like to end it on a positive note, if you've experienced a lot of challenges, hardships in your life, there's always the possibility for change. And then when you do that work on yourself, you heal yourself, you do whatever it is to find the wisdom that you needed on your journey.
Yeah.
When you get to the other balanced side of it, so like on that scale, you experience joy and happiness and contentment so much more deeply because you know what the other side of it looks like. Like, you know what that loss looks like, or the grief or the disappointment. And so because of that, when something good happens, there's such a bigger contrast. And it means like you have the opportunity to appreciate this so much more because you know what the counter could be. So I've always like appreciated that I feel like my life is very rich because of the hardships that I've experienced. And even in, I'll say, for example, the relationship that I'm in now, this person is so great and so respectful and so loving, which I honor and acknowledge because that's not how it was for me in my marriage. And so I have the comparison to be able to identify this is really good. And then anytime that we've had conflict or needing to have like a tougher, I call them scratchy conversation, we can do it with so much more awareness. And I can call it out so much faster because I can see like, oh, nope, if this even veers close to like what it was before, I'm not going to stand for that. So I'm going to stand up for myself. And so that was a learning for me to like be able to speak up for myself. So there's always wisdom to be gleaned.
Yeah, for sure. Judy, you are a published author, and the book that you have is The Little Book of Tibetan Rites and Rituals. I'd love for you to share what inspired you to write that and what that book is about.
It's funny that you asked that because the former A++ student in me is like, yeah, it has 4 stars, not 5 on Amazon. I should have written it differently. But what's interesting is like opportunities have always come to me, remarkable opportunities very easily. Like even becoming a travel writer, it was through a housemate at the time who was related to a cousin who was the editor and like sent me on my first travel article. I figured out how it went. So then I just took off from there. This opportunity was because I'm in a writing group. And so this publishing house was seeking, writers to write a manuscript, and they offered the topic. And I was like, hey, I was a yoga teacher. I actually, because I lived in China, I have this soul affinity for Tibet and like understanding, like, also the hardships that the country has gone through. So it was a really great opportunity to like dip my toe in because it was published with this independent publishing house in Berkeley, which is where my alma mater was. But it also was the larger publishing house is Simon & Schuster. So I have an author page on Simon & Schuster, which as a kid who grew up like writing since like 2nd grade or 4th grade, I'm like, oh my gosh, it's amazing. And, it's about like just daily rituals. It's taken my understanding of yoga and spirituality and moving it into this very like well-known Tibetan rites ritual that is supposed to be the secret to longevity and the fountain of youth and whatnot. So I actually interviewed and she has a page in there, or like a chapter about her experience writing her book. And so I tried to bring in as many experts as I could. It really ended up, there's like 120 something footnotes. So it's like a dense book considering how like teeny it is. But I'm working on, pitching a different memoir, all about, kind of this living your own truth and light, which can be the antithesis of what a quote unquote good Chinese girl has and should do.
But you're living that authenticity, and you're living into it, and you're fully expressing that, which is, there's so much power and resonance to that.
Yeah.
So I want to, just want to acknowledge that,
Thank you.
I'd love to pick that up and learn more from that.
Thank you.
And as also a fellow podcaster, you also have a podcast called Saving Face.
Yes.
So please tell me.
Yes.
I'd love to hear what inspired you to start that, and what's your journey been like since having that podcast?
Well, I started it because when I was pitching out this memoir idea, I had the opportunity to talk to an agent at CAA, and I think she actually represented Barack Obama. And so she was like, well, what's not being said that needs to be said? And I didn't have a way to articulate that. And so I just started asking a lot of different people in my life, like, as an Asian American, what are the things you wish were talked about? And so as I kept asking, I'm like, wait a minute, this would make a really great podcast. And I am like an avid podcast listener, as is my daughter. And so I was like, well, like I've been wanting to start one for a while now. Why not do this? So I started it and wanted to have a curse word in there to get people's attention, which makes it a little bit harder to search, but it's still fine. We are about to launch like episode 100 soon. And we're in season 4. Yeah. And it started out as being for Asian Americans to break through taboo topics and really empower mental and emotional health. Then it evolved into voices of color. And, I've had all sorts of people from many different backgrounds on the show. And I will get text messages, I'll get emails. Someone sent me an email one time that said she was Googling like adult child of abusive Asian mother and, like how to like live with her, knowing she had to be her caretaker. I forgot all the key terms that she put in there. And she's like, and then I found your podcast. I'm like, you did? That's some SEO right there. So she was like, it was so helpful and like so great. And so it's mostly at the end of the day, I realized for like the younger version of me who wished that I had resources to believe that life was going to be better than what I was experiencing at that time with my family of origin, which I hadn't seen. There was no one to demonstrate that to me. There was no one who looked like me, who had gone through similar experience, who was going to tell me that, hey, I'm on the other side of this and it's great over here. Be patient, like have grace and like compassion for yourself. And the other reason is, my current partner is a school administrator. And when we first started dating, he was working in this predominantly Asian American neighborhood. And I thought tiger parenting stopped when I grew up. And he's like, no, everything that you're telling me, like, that's what I see. I'm like, what are you talking about? And so like, I'm like, no, like now I need a resource for like all of these like younger kids. He's like, yeah, they come in, they're so anxious. They're like perfectionists, like, et cetera, et cetera. And someone said this to me because during COVID as well, there were students who were committing suicide who were in their teens. And that really broke my heart because I remember I specifically said to myself, if I don't get into a college that takes me away from this home environment, I will kill myself. And that wasn't like I'm being dramatic. It's so miserable in this household. I don't want to be here. And the way that, my family was to me was like telling me that like I wasn't worth anything, that like I didn't matter. So like couple that with the extreme, like I didn't feel like so the universe did me a solid. It rejected me from UCLA, which was right up the street from where my parents lived, and it got me into Berkeley. So I moved away and like my life was very different after that. But, I just remember hearing that someone said after they found out that one of these young individuals committed suicide, like, that's so unfortunate because they just haven't been around the sun enough times to know that it's going to get better. And that just broke my heart. Like they just needed more time. They needed more time and lived experience to know it will get better. And this is from someone who's also gone through severe postpartum depression, other like times of depression where like depression, I will add one more book. It's called Furiously Happy by Jenny Lawson. When I lived in Austin, I listened to that book and laughed out loud multiple times because it's all about like mental illness and like mental health. And just this woman deals with such severe things, but she's really tried to like make good out of this really tough situation. And she'll forewarn you, if you listen to it on audiobook, her voice sounds a little bit like a chipmunk. but I find it very enjoyable. And she said that depression is a disease that makes you want to murder yourself. And like, I'd never heard anybody express it like that before. Like, it is a lie. It's lying to you. And so whatever you feel is so real is not real. And when I was in the throes of postpartum depression before I started the podcast, I was suicidal. I did have suicidal ideation. And thankfully, I was able to see a doctor who said, I can help you with this. And at the time, my husband's dad was also a doctor who's very intuitive and was as much Eastern as Western focused. He's a very esteemed doctor. So he called my husband and asked, like, how's Judy doing? Because he just had a sense that like something was off, even though they don't talk very often. And my husband at the time was like, oh, she's fine. And he called again 2 days later. He's like, how's Judy doing? He's like, oh, she's not doing very well. He's like, I know her. She's going to want to explore these natural modalities. Her brain chemistry has changed. You need to get her to go see an MD who will help her. Because he did that, and because I went to go see this MD who was very helpful, because the first time in my 20s when I tried anti-anxiety medication, it made me feel like a zombie. It was terrible. And I told her, I was like, I do not want that. I don't want that. And she goes, we will figure out the right medication and the right dosage for you. But I'm telling you right now, suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. It's a permanent solution to a temporary problem. If you choose that path, I cannot help you, but I can help you now. So please let me help you. And so, all of that just made me feel like I at least want someone to have a resource, to know that they're not alone, to know that it can and will get better, and to know that someone else has been in the darkest of times and has been able to move through it. And here are some techniques and tools that you could hopefully, find something that resonates with you. But yeah, like I don't ever want anyone to feel alone and like so hopeless and so lost. And I know people have different economic statuses. So like you can or cannot afford therapy, and or cultural beliefs and shame and stigma around it. Like I get that too. And so I want people to just have something so that they know that they're not alone and that there can still be hope.
Yeah. Wow, Judy. Well, first of all, thank you for creating that podcast. I'm a subscriber, and I encourage my Boom Vision audience to subscribe to it too, because you have such a warm voice, and just the messages you have and you share and the people you interview it's fantastic. So
Thank you.
I definitely highly encourage that.
Thank you.
And in terms of wrapping this up, Judy, my second to last question is this, because I always ask this to all my guests on the show, which is that if the DeLorean was real and that the time machine exists, the way I'll phrase this question for you, Judy, is if you can travel back in time, because you mentioned that your daughter right now is 8 years old.
Mm-hmm.
You can travel back to your 8-year-old self, whether you want to call that your inner child or whether you call that Judy, younger version of Judy. You have an opportunity to just speak to her. What would you say to your younger self, your 8-year-old younger self?
I would say you're absolutely loved. I would say there will be moments in life where things will be very hard and challenging, and beautiful gifts will come through it, including your own personal growth and wisdom, and that those will be the most valuable things to create a life that you love. And you will really, really love your life, even if it doesn't look the way that you thought it was going to.
That's very heartfelt.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So, Judy, last question. Where can our audience find you?
Yeah, thank you for asking. So the Fuck Saving Face podcast, you can find that on all of your major platforms. I use an asterisk for the U in the expletive. You can also go to wildheartedwords.com and you will learn more about me. There's a blog there. The podcast episodes are there as well. And I'm hosting challenges to help rewrite your mindset and shift, what it is that you believe, and to take these daily steps to move towards like a life that you really love and want to create. And yeah, I'm on all the social channels, either by my name, Judy, Tsuei, or by Wild Hearted Words. And so you can find me all over the place, sharing all sorts of things, sometimes being ridiculous, sometimes being totally professional. But yeah.
But you are being you. And that's
Yes.
what's awesome about it. No, and all of your information I'll include in the show notes. So that'll be very easy for our listeners to find you. And I want to just say this, that the imagery I got as just throughout this whole interview is like, I see you as a lighthouse on a Hawaiian island that's helping people break through the fog and the mist and what they're not able to see. So you providing the voice for the voiceless, you providing the light where people might feel it's dark, is such a blessing. And whatever I can do to help you amplify that, I would love to. So I really appreciate your time here on the show, Judy. Is there any message you want to share with the audience, before we wrap up?
Well, I love that you said lighthouse, because I was like, wait, is there a lighthouse on Hawaii? And I'm like, actually, yes, I live right down the road from the lighthouse. It's called the Kilauea Lighthouse. I was like, wait, how did I forget that? So it's still my dream of all dreams to, flip my time part on the islands and then part in San Diego. So, you can also find me surfing. So if anybody surfs, wants to go paddle out in San Diego, let me know. I would say, just a reminder to be wildly you. I remember growing up with a lot of friends in high school and junior high who had very domineering parents and lived their lives trying their best to make themselves fit into whatever expectations were being set forth for them. And the amount of mental load that created and how detrimental it was to their mental and emotional health. And then also me being able to see the light that they had, that they were so creative and so talented in so many other ways that were not traditionally valued, is a dimming of this gift that each person has. And then also just I don't think any of us feel very good when we're trying to twerk ourselves into some weird position that's not actually who we are or how our bodies even work and how our minds even work. And so I hope that this interview and the work that you do and all the other people out there who are encouraging you to just even take that micro step a little bit more to who you innately are, who you've always been. I hope that you feel like you're given permission to do that. And I think so often we just need to be reminded, we do have permission for that, to check in with the stories that you're still telling yourself and holding in your mind. Are those even accurate anymore? Have I changed as the narrator? Have I changed as the hero or the heroine of the story? Is this even the right book that I want to be in? Do I belong in an epic saga or a fantasy, whatever it is, a children's book? So yeah, just remembering that there will only ever be one of you throughout all of time. And that's huge and profound. And when you find out how many universes exist in this space that we all inhabit, it's wild that we exist. So I hope that there's just a little bit more permission to be wildly you.
What a beautiful gift and message. And so, Judy, thank you so much again for joining us today. And I look forward to, like I said, amplifying whatever I can to help you amplify your light. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Folks, I hope you all enjoyed today's interview with Judy. When I listen to Judy's life journey and her continuous healing she has experienced from various modalities, I feel inspired. I totally agree with what Judy shared, in that everyone has a different path to take to find their own wisdom. What I've shared in my Boom Vision community is that you can't expect to copy someone else's answers and assume it will work for you, because everyone is taking a different test. If there's a quote I can share that I feel captures the essence of today's candid conversation, it's this: life has no limitations except the ones you make. This quote was by Les Brown. Folks, I hope you allow yourself the space and grace to heal and grow. I hope by hearing Judy's personal story of how she healed from her past, that it inspires you to rise each time you fall, and that you find a positive solution to any temporary challenge you may encounter. You've got this. If you enjoyed today's interview, share this episode with who you feel can resonate with Judy's story. If you're new to this show, I welcome you to hit that subscribe button to this Boom Vision podcast if you are hungry to grow mentally, physically, and spiritually. Until next time, folks, be kind to yourself. Be in the light. Be you. Thank you so much for tuning in to my Boom Vision podcast. If you'd like to find out more about me and this podcast, head over to benjaminyeh.com. That's spelled BenjaminYeh.com. If you haven't already, click subscribe, and I'll catch you next time.